Welcome to week 8 of the four postures of a disciple. This week, we're going to be jumping back to the posture of walking, which is this posture of movement. It's really this idea of putting into motion everything that's going on internally. And so we do a lot of these other disciplines, the discipline of, reading God's word and prayer and those sort of things, so that we can put things into motion. We can walk them out. And so kind of the core component of this posture of walking is the idea of contributing, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. But I want to take that idea and transfer it into this idea of faith, this discipline, this principle of faith that we see so frequently throughout Scripture. I mean, it's all over the place. And realistically, there's so much to talk about when it comes to faith that we could spend 2 or 3 weeks at least trying to cover it all. And so this will not be a comprehensive discussion about faith. We may supplement some things in the future. But for the purposes of this discussion, I really want to look at what faith means for us in the context of being a disciple. So as a disciple, someone who is living to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus does, what is faith in that situation? And what do we need faith for? How do we apply that faith to being a disciple? And so to help try to quantify what faith is, sometimes it's helpful to discuss a little bit about what faith isn't. And so real briefly, I just want to say faith is not wishful thinking or positive thinking. It's not just going, I think positively about the situation. It's not always even just a, I think this way kind of thing. Anyways, as we get into this discussion a little bit more, we'll see faith is much more action-based than that. But faith isn't just wishful thinking. It's not just going, oh, I hope that's going to happen, or I think that's going to happen because I believe really, really hard, or I've thought positively about it. It's not what faith is. Hebrews 11:1, the author of Hebrews, is going to give us a definition of faith that I want to take and expand upon a little bit. So Hebrews 11:1 is going to say, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So faith isn't just going, oh, I hope for that. It's an assurance of what we hope for. It's a confidence in what we don't yet see. And so the author is going to take the rest of chapter 11 in Hebrews to lay out what faith has looked like all throughout biblical history. He's going to start from the very beginning and kind of lay out, hey, this is what Noah did, and this is what Moses did, and this is what Abraham did, and he's going to kind of give us these pictures of men and women of faith all throughout Scripture to illustrate this is what faith really looks like. They didn't just think positively, they just didn't hope without any kind of foundation, but they had a promise, a command, or a call from God, and they acted upon it, fully believing with full assurance that what God said is what was going to happen. And so we can kind of look at that and see a little bit more of a definition of faith. Now, I'll add this to this discussion that the pastor Rick Warren is going to have a quote where he's going to say, you only really believe and trust the parts of the Bible that you're willing to do. And so it's easy to read the Bible and go, oh yeah, I think that principle's true. I think being kind to people is probably a good way of doing things. And I believe that if I were to be kind, that would be a good thing to do. That's not faith. That's kind of a mental assent to an idea and saying, yeah, I agree with that idea, but you haven't really believed that idea. It hasn't really become belief until you're willing to put kindness into action in real life situations. You haven't truly believed it. You haven't really made it a faithful decision until you've been faithful to do it. And so faith and action are very, very intricately and intimately connected. James, in the book of James, is going to say very bluntly that faith without action is dead. That he's like, hey, you show me your faith by what you don't do, and I'll show it to you by what I do. That action is what illustrates and shows faith to the world around us. And without that kind of action, without that step to say, I'm going to do what I say I believe, you haven't really had faith until you've done it. And so I want to offer this definition in light of this idea of being a disciple, someone who's living to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus does. What is faith? I think faith is an obedient response to the promise, command, or call of a trustworthy God. I'll say it again if you're trying to write it down, that faith is an obedient response to the promise, command, or call of a trustworthy God. And so I want to spend a little bit of time breaking that down. What does that mean for us? Well, first, faith is an obedient response, that it's hearing from God. It's hearing something God has said, as we kind of define here, either a promise of his, a command of his, or a call for us to respond. It's for us to obediently respond to that promise, command, or call because God is trustworthy, because he's been faithful in the past. And so we can read through Hebrews 11 and see all these little snapshots of how God has been faithful in the past. And we can go, well, he was faithful for them, he'll be faithful for me. And his faithfulness can fill up our fullness of faith. That seeing how faithful God has been can provide for us a fullness of our own faith, because we can go, he's trustworthy. He's good. I can see that I can trust what he says, that I can put my full weight on it. If you think about trying to sit in a chair, I can say, hey, I think this chair will hold me. I believe that the people who designed this chair made it so that it will sufficiently hold my weight. But I have not believed in that chair. I have not really truthfully believed that it will do it until I've put my full weight on it, until I've let myself sit in it. And at that point, I've had the faith to trust the chair. Now, once I've done that once I've seen the chair will hold me, I now see that chair is faithful, that it's held up to its promise. And so I'm much more willing to trust it the next time and get to a point where my faith it's not necessarily even a thinking process where I have to convince myself to do it. I just know that the chair will hold me because it's held me in the past. And so this is a picture of going, God is a trustworthy God. He's been faithful in the past. I can trust him to do what he said he's going to do. If he's promised it, if he's commanded it, if he's called me to it, then I can put my full weight on him because he's trustworthy. And so faith is going, I'm going to obediently respond, even if I don't see how it makes sense. I don't see how it makes sense yet. Like he's going to call us to a certain way of doing marriage, where the guy is supposed to die to self and live for the wife. The wife is supposed to submit and love. There's supposed to be love and respect between the two, where there's a submission to one another. Doing marriage that way doesn't always make sense in our mind. But if we trust God, we're willing to go, I'm going to put my weight on how he's commanded me to do it. Finances. He said, hey, I want you to be generous and contributing. I want you to give. And there's outlines of, 10% and whatever the percentage might be. That's not the point of our discussion, but to go, I trust that God says this is the best way to handle finances, for me to be generous and to give away and to trust him that he's going to be able to do more with 90% than I can do with 100%. And so I'm going to put my full weight on, this is the way he's commanded me to use my finances. This is the way he's called me to live in marriage. This is the way he's called me to parent. And so we can go, okay, this is what he said. I don't always understand it, but it goes back to that. It's a confidence in, an assurance of, God has commanded it. He's promised it. He's called me to it. I can put my full weight on it because he's trustworthy. And so that's really how faith starts to work out. Now, the question I need to ask is, as a disciple, what is it that we need faith for? Why do we need to apply faith? And so I think really what we'll start to see pretty quickly, I'm going to read a couple verses, we'll start to see what it is we need faith for. So Hebrews 11:6, a little further down after that definition, the writer's going to say, and without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So in order to please God, we need faith. Ephesians 3:12 is going to say, in him and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. So even being with God, being near God, is only done through faith in him. So to be with him, we need it. To become like him, we need it. To please him, Romans 14:23 is going to say, and everything that does not come from faith is sin. So to be able to do what he does, to be able to be with him, become like him, and do what he does, we need faith for everything. Paul's going to write in the first chapter of Romans, he's going to say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, the right way to live for God, the right, complete, perfect path, the way to please God in my living is revealed in the gospel. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So Paul's just said, hey, the way to live rightly as a disciple, the way to live, to be with him, become like him, and do what he does is only by faith from the very beginning to the very end. That salvation, our salvation is by faith. Paul's going to write in Ephesians chapter 2 that it's by grace that you have been saved through faith. And even that faith isn't of your own doing. It's a gift from God. So it's by grace through faith in Christ that we're saved to begin with. The way in which we're transformed is by having faith in God, by getting near to him, by doing the things that please him, is all done by faith. And so our justification is by faith. Our sanctification is by faith. Our glorification is by faith. It's all done by faith. The only way to please God, the only way to live rightly, to live righteously is, as Paul writes in Romans 1, the righteous will live by faith. And even that, he's not just making that up. He's quoting that from the Old Testament, and it's quoted in other places as well, that this is kind of a theme in the Bible, that the righteous will live by faith. And so I just want to give a few examples that come out of that Hebrews 11 and a little bit into Hebrews 12 of how God has been faithful, and then a little charge here at the end. But Hebrews 11, 8 through 19, the writer's going to highlight Abraham for a second. He's going to say, starting in verse 8, excuse me, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. And so the writer's going to highlight Abraham, which I think is an amazing story. That God comes to Abraham. And I think we need the context of this, that at this point in time in history, there's not roads to travel on. There's not protection along those roads or police forces in cities. It's family groups that are sticking together and kind of multiplying their family out for protection, for provision. They're going with their flocks and their herds everywhere. The main way to survive in this day and age is to stick with your family. You stay where you were born, and you live with that group so that you can be protected by them and provided for by them. And God comes to this man who doesn't know him. God hasn't been revealing himself all over the place at this point, but he comes to Abraham and he says, I want you to trust me and go to this place. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you an inheritance of a land that is flowing with milk and honey. He's saying, hey, it's going to provide for you. It's going to richly, generously provide for you. I want you to go to this land, and I'm going to make of you a nation. I'm going to make people out of you, and you're not even going to be able to number them. And so the promise is, hey, I'm going to take you, I'm going to provide protection, I'm going to provide provision, but you need to start walking in that direction. You have no idea where you're going. I just need you to trust me and start walking that way. And Abraham does it. And I want us to see that that's a little bit crazy. Like, that does not necessarily make sense up here. The smart, wise thing to do, according to most standards, would be, no, I'm going to stay put with my family. This is where I'm safe. This is where I'm provided for. But Abraham trusts God, steps out on faith. He obediently responds to the call of God, to the promise of God, to the command of God to go to a land that you've never seen before, to a place that you don't even know how to get to, and I'm going to provide for you. And he does it. He obeys. And God says, even to Abraham and Sarah, when they're well beyond being able to have children, he says, I'm going to give you a child. They hadn't had children up to this point. He says, I'm going to give you a child, and they're well past childbearing age, and God provides a child. And just all these different ways that God provided for Abraham, that we get to see, hey, God came through for them. Abraham stepped out and obediently responded in a situation that didn't necessarily make sense, but he put his weight on the promise and the call of God. And it's going to tell us that faith was counted to him as righteousness. That God saw that as an extreme measure of faith, that God said, okay, you're living by faith, and the righteous live by faith. This is the way it was meant to be from the beginning, not to live by the law. We're going to see, especially in Romans, Paul's going to compare faith to the law. He's going to say the law, you did this and you did that. You checked off boxes. It was about how you could earn it, how you could prove it. And now it's all done by faith. Now it's saying, I trust that Jesus has done it. I trust that Jesus is doing it in me. I'm going to put all my weight on him and trust that he's got me. And I'm going to live my life saying I'm obediently responding to the command, the promise, or the call of a God who's proven himself to be trustworthy. And so as we move from looking at Hebrews 11, there's so much listed there, so many good stories of God's faithfulness in people's lives as they put their weight and their faith on him. I want to shift to looking at Hebrews 12, where the author is going to come out of there. He's going to say, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, since we are surrounded by these people who are willing to witness and testify to, God was faithful here. He was faithful here. I placed my faith in him here, and look what he did. And we're able to see this great cloud of witnesses testifying to the faithfulness of God. He says, because we can see that, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. That he says, get rid of everything, all the things that aren't by faith, all the sin of not trusting God, of not believing him. Get rid of all that, because he is faithful. He is true. He is worth trusting. You can put your weight fully on him. And they say, get rid of all that stuff. Obediently respond. Run the race that's marked out for you. God has put something in front of you and said, I want you to live this out by faith. Run this out by faith. Walk it out by faith. Saying, listen, we can testify to it's worth it. Whatever the struggle, whatever it costs to throw all that off, whatever pain you might encounter, struggle you might encounter, whatever might come your way, keep the faith. It's worth it, they would say. Some of them died in horrific ways. Some of them never got to see the fullness of what they were promised. Abraham never got to see the fullness of what God promised him. But he would testify today, if he was standing in front of us, he would say, it's worth it to trust God. It's worth it to put our faith in him. It's worth it to live a righteous life by faith, no matter what the cost is. And so, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Jesus is the one who created faith. He's the one that initiated faith, and he's the one who perfected it. He lived his life by faith completely. And it says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, sat down at the right hand of the Father on the throne of God. And so consider him, Jesus, who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Listen, this is what the author's trying to tell you. It's worth it. Whatever it costs. Whatever it takes, whatever sacrifice has to be made to go, I trust God's way of living this life. I trust the way he's laid out for me to approach him, the way for me to come to him by faith. I trust the way he said I should do my marriage and how I should die to myself so I can serve my wife. I trust the way he said this is the way you should parent your children. I trust the way this is how you should do your finances. And so whatever it costs, whatever it looks like, whatever it feels like, it's worth every bit of it. Paul is going to write and say, I consider these light and momentary afflictions in comparison to the glory that is to come. Now, Paul didn't have light momentary afflictions. Paul had heavy and sustained afflictions according to how we see them. He was shipwrecked. He was bitten by snakes. He was beaten. He was whipped. He was, scorned and hated. And he says it's worth it. None of that even matters in comparison to living a life by faith and the reward that comes from knowing Jesus by faith. It's all worth it. And so again, faith is an obedient response to the promise, command, or calling of a trustworthy God, and it's worth it. And so this is my charge, my challenge to you. Some of us, I think why we struggle so much with this idea of faith, why it's so common for people to not understand it, to not live by it, I think there's a couple reasons. One, it can be a little bit scary to really step out in faith, to not feel like you know where that next step is supposed to go. Can be a little scary, but faith is a confidence and an assurance that where you place your foot when you're on Jesus's path, it will always be upheld. I think the other thing is we don't need faith as much as we should. Like, we don't need faith for where we're going to have our next meal. We have a refrigerator and a grocery store and online ordering and direct delivery. Like, that's not a concern of ours. We don't have to live that part of our life by faith. There's so many little parts of our life that we've been able to fill in with technology, or other things that are filling the gap to make it seem like we're secure. When Jesus wants us to trust him for those things, to recognize and celebrate and worship him for the ways he provides for us, even if it is through technology. And so some of us, we don't ever feel like we have to press up against a place of really needing to step out in faith and put our weight fully on God. So my challenge for you is to find those areas of your life this week where you can get right up on that border and of needing faith, get in that situation of really needing to apply it and push yourself into it. That you can find, you probably know those thresholds that you've placed down, those borders that you've said, I'll go this far, but no further. I want you to find that place where you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe it's being a little bit more bold with your faith in your work environment or with your family. Maybe it's trusting God with your finances a little bit more. You know that area where you feel uncomfortable. I want you to find that area and I want you to push into it. Let your weight rest on God in that area. If he's promised it, if he's commanded it, if he's called you to it, you can have confidence and assurance that he will hold you in it, that you can place your weight on him. If he's called you to it, commanded it, promised it, he's trustworthy to follow through. And so my charge for you this week, find that area of uncomfortability, that area that presses on, I need faith to do this, and step out and do it and see what God does. I'd love to hear those stories in the comments of how you've seen God's faithfulness when you've stepped out in faith.